China, the Kingdom of Heaven, the Middle Kingdom, the Sick Man of Asia. All these names refer to one of the most ancient entities in the history of humanity. From the borderline mythical Jia dynasty to the modern People's Republic, this entity and nation has experienced a cyclical history. One dynasty would come to power, then over the course of some centuries become corrupt and decadent, and then lose power to some other dynasty. But now China was a republic, populated by some 1.4 billion people of varying ethnic, religious, and linguistic groups. In the initial decades of the People's Republic, the people were still living as their ancient forefathers have, on farms working the land. By the rise of Deng Xiaoping to power after the death of Mao, the republic's founder, China started embracing the ways of capitalism, with many foreign analysts coming to believing that it has risen to a position of being able to contest the position of global hegemon, which ever since World War II was occupied by the United States. Deng Xiaoping inherited a China that was recovering from the Great Leap Forward, and left it with Huawei, Alibaba, the MG4, and AliExpress. The course of national rejuvenation continued under following chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, but it reached new heights under Chairman Xi Jinping, taking a more aggressive stance both at home against enemies both at home and abroad. However, there was one issue that not a single chairman was able to resolve in the decades since the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949, the Taiwan question. For all the official party talk of the island of Taiwan being an inalienable part of China, it continues to exist as a thorn in the side of the CPC. Despite all the modern technology which the PRC could now use to turn rhetoric into reality, it still could not do so for two major reasons. The People's Liberation Army had not fought a war since the 80s when it failed to achieve its objectives against Vietnam, but also because starting a war over Taiwan had a high likelihood of drawing the other powers into it. Japan and Australia could be handled with ease by the much larger PLA, but the Americans were much more powerful than China, Japan, and Australia put together. Thus China had to wait for an opportune moment. For as the proverb goes, if you wait long enough by the river, the bodies of your enemies will eventually float by. But not everything was going well internally by the 2020s. A virus in a lab in Wuhan has escaped containment, spreading rapidly and infecting people since 2019. As time went on, the number of infected began creeping up into the millions. International flights were cancelled, social distancing and disinfection measures were introduced in all public spaces. But the bodies of the dead began mounting, with the situation getting to a point at which it was safer to burn the bodies rather than give them a proper burial. The virus spread chaos all across the world as the peoples all over the globe were now stuck inside with nothing to do but spend time on the internet. In the chaos, one of the most important countries in the business of oil trade, Saudi Arabia, collapsed into a civil war after the death of their king. This then caused a global oil crisis, as everyone began scrambling to find alternatives to Saudi oil, which played right into the hands of Beijing's close partner, Moscow.
为什么我知道漂泊的人心中都有一团火，假如你有看到我，请给我一个拥抱，我偶尔沉默，但也勇敢执着。你看到的我，你看到的我，是哪一种颜色？悲伤或快乐？也许老了一点，眼神变得不再那么清澈，热血依然沸腾着我的脉搏。你看到的我，你看到的我，是哪一种性格？快乐或慢热，像勇敢的雄鹰，不怕风雨，不怕困难挫折。如果要飞就飞出天空海阔，我就是我。匆忙的世界
来不及问为什么，我知道漂泊的人心中都有一团火。
假如你又看到我，请给我一个拥抱。我偶尔沉默，但也勇敢执着。
你看到的我，你看到的我，是哪一种颜色？
The Civil War was over with a royalist victory in June of 2021, with the PLA ground forces and air force showing incredible strength on the battlefield over the Western-backed coalitions. PLA commanders grew confident in themselves and their soldiers, as despite not having fought a proper war in many decades, they were still able to go toe-to-toe with Western armies. At the same time, the Minister for State Security, Cheng Wen-ching, began reporting about utter chaos in the United States, with the country completely being torn apart by rival political groups, separatists, and various radicals now vying for power over what used to be the United States of America. Everyone in China understood what came next. With America out of the picture, the road to Taipei was now open. That day was fast approaching. The PLA ground, navy, and air forces began assembling at key points for the upcoming campaign. Military exercises on the ground, on the sea, and in the air were ramped up dramatically. The Japanese and Australians began propping up Taiwan for the coming confrontation. On March 9th of 2022, the 20th National Congress of the CCP convened. The decision to reunify the socialist motherland by force was settled on irreversibly. On August 11th, the Kinmen Islands were seized by the PLA. The Rubicon has been crossed. However, the more level-headed commanders began noticing problems with how the PLA conducted itself. Too many weapons proved ineffective, and too many officers were plagued by the peace disease, resulting in a sluggish and highly deviant implementation of orders from above. But the majority were riding high on the small victory.
China fired rockets into waters off northern and southern Taiwan on Tuesday. Beijing released a video purporting to show its forces firing toward waters north of Taiwan as part of its, quote, Justice Mission 2025 war games. China also deployed new amphibious assault ships alongside bomber aircraft and destroyers in a rehearsal for a blockade of the island.
On September 1st, Taiwan was bombarded by missiles from ships and aircraft. Now it was time to finish what Mao had started. In the first days of fighting, the problems first noticed by a few on Kinmen were brought to light for all officers and generals to see. The enemy had also blockaded the Strait of Malacca, the most vital maritime trade artery for China. The initial landings on Taiwan have also failed, but this blockade being broken through was paramount for the survival of the economy to continue the war. On October the 26th, the blockade was broken through. The PLA could refocus all its attention to the real prize. In November, its second landing was attempted, now with the PLA having learned from their errors in the first landing. In January, seeing the slow progress against Taiwan, dissidents in Hong Kong took up arms against the PRC. These rebels were put down with absolute brutality. A full year into this campaign, almost 200,000 PLA warriors have fallen, taking almost just as many enemies with them. Both the soldiers and generals could see the writing on the wall. This campaign is a failure, and will only continue to bring back many soldiers home in coffins with little to no ground gains. And so, the PLA was ordered to withdraw from the island back to the mainland. The campaign was lost, and China had been humiliated yet again. A wave of protests and military mutiny swept across the vast country. The economy was in shambles and the generals were livid with the government's handling of the campaign. Order completely collapsed in non-Chinese areas like Xinjiang and Tibet. Seeing the collapse of law and order, the Chief of Staff, Zhang Yujia, took over the government, ousting Xi Jinping and his clique from power. Martial law was declared in Beijing and all other big cities.
无论谁想把台湾以任何形式从中国分裂出去，中国决定。
The party needed a new chairman urgently. Zhang announced an election. There were 3 candidates with their own merits. Cheng Changguo was the former CPC secretary for the Xinjiang Autonomous Region, currently semi-retired, holding only symbolic roles. It was him who was responsible for imposing a strict administration in the Uyghur-populated territories. The other option was Chief of Staff Li Zhuocheng, the man responsible for the more successful operations of the Taiwan campaign. The third contender was the Minister for State Security, Chen Wenjing. Chen Changguo emerged victorious. A new age was beginning for China, as the party was now split between Han ultranationalists and Confucianists. By December, order was mostly restored in China proper. Now it was time to start securing the periphery. Some days later, Pakistan went to war with India. Chinese representatives were able to successfully convince both sides of this war to not use their nuclear arsenals. This gave the PLA the opportunity to intervene and help Pakistan emerge victorious. The Indo-Pakistani War ended in March of 2024. By now, having mostly recovered from the chaos which followed the defeat in the Taiwan campaign, the government was feeling confident in its ability to turn theory into reality once again. Thus, the East Asian Defense Initiative was established to combat the PDTO and its influence in Southeast Asia. However, this alliance was not one of equals. It was a strictly Chinese-centered organization, aimed at establishing total Chinese control over the traditional Sinosphere. The first victim of this policy was Mongolia. After that, the PLA aimed its guns at Vietnam, Myanmar, Cambodia, and Laos. Meanwhile, inside China itself, significant societal and ideological changes were taking place. Hawkish intelligentsia, such as Professor Ai Yuejin, began giving lectures preaching that compromise with weakness is deeply harmful to the Chinese nation. People like him became what revanchists called the national backbone,
怎么讲呢？大量裁减中央军队，你想中
advocating for Chinese interests no matter the cost.
错乱嘛，因此
Other intellectuals began speaking of how outsiders, especially the West, always stole great Chinese achievements throughout their history, such as Marxism being actually Chinese in its origins, with Confucius being the actual creator of what that German Gweile would then corrupt into his own ideology. Traditionalist societies were becoming more popular with the aid of government propaganda. The Confucianists within the post-Taiwan CPC were beginning to transform in a way that would be unthinkable just a year ago. They introduced a new religious education program, teaching the young generations traditional values: righteousness, integrity, propriety, and shame. More moderate people in Chinese society and government were becoming deeply concerned as to what direction their country was going, especially the older generation. When it came to foreign religions, like Islam and Christianity, the government undertook the harshest policy possible. For over a decade now, the West condemned China for its policy towards Muslims in the Xinjiang province. But with the radicalizing, ultra-nationalistic CPC, the policies practiced under Chiang Kuo's secretaryship became absolute. Mosques were demolished, and Christians were persecuted. Whereas native Chinese sects were not just left alone, but encouraged and bolstered. Traditionalist reforms continued in the intellectual life of China. Many Western historians and writers' valuable works were removed and destroyed in order to be replaced by proper Chinese writers. Historical revisionism and propaganda even expanded beyond world history and into Chinese history, with the system now teaching students of the glory of the Zhao, the strength of the Qin, the stability of the Han, and the prosperity of the Tang. The population still had to be properly mentally prepared for the changes yet to come, as mastering the past was also mastering the future. Changes also touched upon the very structure of the Chinese state itself. Chiang Kuo embarked upon restoring the ancient rights of Zhao. This was a grand work to restore the ancient terrestrial offices. The spring offices focused on ceremonies, culture, and rituals. The summer offices focused on the organization of the armed forces. The autumn offices focusing on administering justice and court rights. And finally, the winter offices focused on public works, craftsmanship, and art. There were also the offices of heaven, focused on the general principles of governance, and the offices of earth, focusing on local governance and taxation. Naturally, such actions stirred much opposition to Chairman Chiang Kuo, but having the full trust of the army and the long arm of the MSS, there was nothing they could do when the party purchase came. None were to stand between the glorious chairman and the revival of the Chinese nation. By 2031, Chiang Kuo and his Confucianist clique felt prepared to forever transform China. On the 29th of July, the Central Committee of the CPC debated national legitimacy, ethnic destiny, pluralism, and civilizational mission of China. However, nobody used the term republic any longer to refer to China. It was too closely associated with words like compromise, which in turn was associated with weakness. After the meeting, behind closed doors, Chiang Kuo said that the historical phase of the republic was over, and that starting from sometime next month, China will be called the Chinese People's Empire. The empire was to be unified, orderly, and eternal. On the 29th of August, the empire issued the Imperial Edict of changing name to a number of international organizations. Empire was back. The world looked on in horror as everyone realized what this meant in practical terms. Non-Han peoples were not safe in China before the Taiwan campaign, but now, Sinicization was official state policy. Initially, not everyone in China was on board with this sudden change and diversion from the course outlined by Deng Xiaoping and Xi Jinping. However, this was remedied by posthumously proclaiming Mao Zedong as the first People's Emperor. By the end of 2031, the economy was revived and overhauled. The administrative apparatus was restored to that how ancient China had it, and the PLA was fully reformed in every single one of its aspects. The lessons of the Taiwan campaign were taken into consideration and implemented to make it a mighty force worthy to conquer a continent. The PLA was expanded to almost 3 million personnel, covering all major front lines of the looming confrontation with the PDTO: Pakistan, Bengal, the coastline, and Korea. But the first shots of this conflict were not fired at the Indians or the Japanese, but at Pakistan. In May of 2032, the PLA crossed the Pakistani border with the proclaimed aim of establishing a purification zone Hindustan. The wording of the official war goal left little to the imagination, knowing what was happening with non-Han populations in China itself. In a small apartment in the coastal town of Jianmen, scarred by a war that happened almost a decade ago, a jaded, disgruntled, shriveled old man was watching the news on his cheap television. It was nothing but all the same.
近日，國防部發言人宣布，根據帝國法院常務委員會最新通過的《中華帝國兵役法》修正案，國家將增加武裝部隊總兵力500萬。
國家安全部聲明指出，隨着我國民眾反間諜意識的提升，在境內
中華民族向來非凡，中華民族優於世上所有其他族。
The old man was left in nearly complete darkness. The only thing anyone could hear anymore was the weeping and sobbing of its occupant, as there was no more television to block them out.
都是我的錯，要是當初我做得更好就好了。
He was not there to save China and set her on the right path. He was nobody now. He was nothing now. He may as well no longer have a name. The battle lines have been drawn in the sand. Half of Southeast Asia was either under China or with the Western imperialists. It could no longer be delayed. The emperor ordered the beginning of Operation Zhanyuan, named after a mythical heroic emperor of the past. The strategy was established, the cipher was chosen, the approaches were monitored. Now it was a matter of firing the shot. the first days of the war, the PLA successfully landed on Taiwan, but was bogged down. But at the same time, the enemy was unable to beat the soldiers back into the sea. For now, the focus of the PLA was on India. But also the Korean allies began storming over the DMZ. The deeper the PLA fought its way into India, the more stubborn the resistance became. Yi Zuo-cheng ordered the use of nuclear, biological, bacteriological, and chemical weapons against the enemy. These barbarians were to be wiped out by any means necessary, even if it meant that the grass will no longer grow wherever the boot of a PLA soldier stepped. On the 17th of March of 2033, Changguo authorized the nuking of Tokyo. The blasts killed the royal family, with the Japanese Emperor Naruhito being replaced with Fumihito. This demoralization of the Japanese population was to demonstrate what awaited the Japanese people if the Chinese ever came onto the Japanese home islands. Heavy fighting in India continued. In early June, seeing how hopeless the situation was becoming, the Indian government agreed to a separate peace with Beijing. Seeing the weakness of the Indian state, what remained of the country burst into civil war. The PLA army groups that took down the Indian elephant could now focus on the new primary theater of this war, Korea. On October 1st, Busan had fallen despite Japanese, Australian, and South Korean forces' efforts. The PLA could now completely focus its attention on finishing off all enemy resistance on the island of Taiwan. Within the month, Taiwan was fully occupied by the PLA. The new primary theater of this war was now Southeast Asia, with the PLA's goal being to fight their way towards Australia. Seeing the stubborn efforts of the PDTO imperialists, PLA High Command made the decision to attempt to land on the Japanese home islands. Despite the initial success, rapid Japanese reinforcements and last-ditch detachments of militias were thrown at the PLA warriors with no regard for their own lives. Another landing was attempted, but it only resulted in more Chinese armies being destroyed. The landing attempts were a complete disaster, forcing the PLA to fight its way head-on against the enemy in the jungles of Indochina and Southeast Asia. By June of 2035, Indochina and all of Southeast Asia were completely conquered by the PLA. Now the next step was securing Australasia. By summer of 2036, over 1 million Chinese warriors have perished while being able to claim the lives of almost 4 million Japanese. Now was the time to finish this war. But having learned from past landing attempts, the PLA was going to guarantee total success on the third attempt. On the 26th of June, Operation Burn Sun was given the green light. By July 25th of 2036, having destroyed all enemy resistance, the war was over, with a great Chinese victory no less. The Western barbarian once sought to subjugate the great Chinese nation, yet here it was. The Chinese nation was on top of the world. It was standing victorious over its barbarian enemies. The traditional Sinosphere was secured and expanded. Now all those who did not wish to be erased and Sinicized had to give tribute to the Chinese People's Emperor, Chen Changguo. However, it did not yet appease the 100 years of rage that festered within the Chinese nation. Asia had to be reorganized into more purification zones. Hindustan could not be allowed to ever get into a position of ever being able to pose a threat to China again. Once upon a time, the Chinese were willing to dance equally with the other nations of the world. But now they had nothing but divine hatred for the cunning and opportunistic barbarians. With their yellow hands, the Chinese nation inscribed golden laws. With their black-haired blood, the Chinese cleansed the shame of the past. The Ganges was drained as enemy corpses piled into it. The eastern islands were finally back in the fold of the Sinosphere. Oceania was strung together like jewels on a crown. Very few knew how the Imperial Court intends on governing the vast lands which it now occupies. But everyone in the world understood that the whole region of Asia will, in the coming decades, centuries even, become a lot less culturally, religiously, and ethnically diverse. After 1,000 years of silence, the dragon has woken, having let out an almighty roar filled with 100 years of wrath. Now the world will understand that for the next 1,000 years, the Chinese nation will be unshaken. The world could do nothing about it, and they won't, because sovereignty is not something for the barbarians to question.